Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here again, talking about the subject of biblical symbolism. Now, we've been going through all kinds of different introductory things about biblical symbolism, and still today we're on the introductory things. There's a lot to think about before we get into the symbols themselves, why they're so important, how they have developed through history, and why we need them today. We also looked at a lot of the mischief that's going on today with people's language and how there's a lot of dishonesty with how people listen to each other. The same thing is true of the Bible. People will take the Bible, they'll twist it to mean all kinds of different things. And we need to be able to correct that. And symbolism actually helps us quite a bit. It gives a lot of richness and depth to the way that we think, the way that we look at the world, the way that we read the Bible, and the way that we communicate with one another, and is much needed today. And so what I want to look at is some of the history of symbolism in the Christian era, and we'll look at the biblical information later because there's just so much. We've got to break that down into classes, basically, of it. So I'm going to start today with medieval allegory. Now, medieval allegory is the method of interpretation that starts early in the life of the church in the Alexandrian school of thought. So there's the church in Alexandria, Egypt. So there's a guy, particularly church father, named Origen. A guy, Origen, the genius of allegory in the early church, really was a genius. And he came up with these allegories a lot of times that were so fanciful that people really started to get fairly uncomfortable with a lot of the things he was saying, but he was undoubtedly a genius. He also had some problems with his formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity, but the guy was, as typically goes with geniuses, is that they're so intelligent and so capable of communication that they end up being able to win an argument with themselves, right? You can't defeat their arguments. There's this great problem of being able to convince them that they may be a little bit on the wrong track because they're so capable. They end up being able to convince you and others that, well, they must know something that I don't. Now, sometimes that can be true. Maybe they do make some pioneer work that's very helpful, and no doubt he was very excellent at what he did. But there's a lot of people who point out that Origen's allegories a lot of times imposed his presupposed psychological categories that he had come up with, or in his theology that he imposed back on the text that didn't necessarily belong there, even in a symbolic meaning. So what ends up developing is a fourfold sense of the scripture, or fourfold meaning of the scripture, called the quadriga. So the fourfold sense, quadriga, means like a fourfold, like basically horse cart kind of deal. But the first is the literal sense, which is what everybody agrees on, that the Bible must be read literally, that there is a literal meaning, historical, grammatical context to what is being said. And then on top of that, they have what's called the tropological sense, which is like the ethical meaning of it. So what's the moral of the story? So like with the Greek myths, you always have the moral of the story. What's the moral of the story? So the Romans and the Greeks, they had that classical way of thinking that basically looks at the tropological sense of a story or a myth. So they did it with the Bible as well. They had a tropological interpretation of the scriptures. What's the moral of the story? What do we do with this? Then you have the allegorical, which is basically like a theological interpretation. And most of the time, it's talking about spiritual things, about the nature of God. Something about God is revealed in the text, this particular text. Now, again, it's usually having to do with the Holy Trinity. So you're running into the Old Testament where you've got something about the Holy Trinity, that this character, and this character represents the Father, this one represents the Son, this one represents the Spirit. And a lot of times it's really illegitimately impressed upon the text. And other times, maybe there's something to it, but a lot of times it's kind of like just imposed upon the text of Scripture itself. And then you've got the anagogical text, meaning instead of allegorical, it's anagogical, which is sometimes called the typological meaning, which basically means that there's types of Christ. So you could call this the Christological meaning of the text, but it's called the anagogical. And anyway, this is just the historic term. I didn't come up with it, so we got to stick with anagogical. And so basically what it is the types and shadows that point to Christ. Now, there's no doubt that there are types and shadows that point to Christ. And unless you are a rank dispensational who rejects typology, like maybe the Ryrian dispensationals who really only believe there's 5 types of Christ in the New Testament that are pointed out, those are the only types of Christ, then you'll recognize there's typology that points to Christ. So what ends up happening is you have the School of Alexandria, and then you have another school of thought in Antioch of Syria, which is not that far away. And the Antiochene fathers point out that the original literal sense should control any latter sense. They don't reject the figurative meaning. They don't reject a typological meaning. They don't reject spiritual or symbolic meanings. But what they do reject is that you start from where your presuppositions are theologically, and then you oppose them on the text. You have to start with the literal, and then from there you can go to the figurative, because you have the historical grammatical meaning of the text controlling ultimately the whole thing. Now, what's interesting about this is you have to think about the fact that you have symbols within the text that are part of the literal meaning, and those symbols come to bear upon the meaning of the text, because if you have a symbol in a text, then that symbol is also going to apply to the literal meaning of other words. So you have to have a little bit of nuance on that and recognize that, yes, there is a literal meaning that controls the text. I do agree with the Antiochene school. So do all Reformed Presbyterians. We're of the mind that the literal, grammatical, historical perspective rules over the figurative. But there is a sense where the figurative may come into play because you have symbols that are curtailing the limits as to what the literal can mean. The propositional can mean only this because there's a symbol that kind of controls it. Then you have the medieval period really symbolizing a lot of things and communicating things in terms of art. Now, there's no doubt that in Europe in the Middle Ages and Christendom, you have immense amounts of artistic portrayals of things. And a lot of people think that there's sort of this backward symbolic mind, that they weren't philosophical and that they weren't propositional in the Middle Ages. They think of it as sort of a dark age where people thought like brute beasts. Everything was symbolic, and they had some places where they would have paintings and they would have some poetry. They had a little bit of music with Hildegard von Bingen, but most of the time it's portrayed as a very dark age, the Dark Ages, where, sort of like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you have people harvesting filth everywhere and just covered in filth, and just everything is filth. And that's how the Middle Ages are. And sure, during times of plague, it was like that. But we also have to look at what was built then. Look at the buildings, look at the stones, look at all the paintings, look at the frescoes, look at all the things in Europe and in Christendom, because there is a lot to learn there. And a lot of it is a very complex system of symbols that really communicate a lot. And I think a couple places you can look that will open your eyes to these things would be Francis Schaeffer's documentaries, How Shall We Then Live? If you look that up, I believe they're all on the internet all over the place. Look up Francis Schaeffer's How Shall We Then Live, or How Then Shall We Live? I can't remember. There's a book, and then there's the documentary series. And then there's also the books by a Dutch Reformed scholar named Hans Rookmacher. Hans Rookmacher wrote books on art history and art interpretation from a Reformed theological perspective, and taught in a Reformed seminary on these things. So very helpful to read. He's got one called Modern Art and the Death of Culture, and another one called Art Needs No Justification, and then a bunch of other books on various artists, basically interpreting their philosophy. And he's really good on showing how art communicates symbolically and gives us an understanding of a worldview. And what we're seeing in the medieval art, medieval symbols, is that they're communicating the nature of their theology to us. This is PBR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.